Welcome everyone to our talk on Professor Timothy Benedict's book, Spiritual Ends, Religion in the Heart of Dying in Japan. My name is Michael Skaggs. I'm Director of Programs for the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. Let me thank you all for being here, especially because this is outside of our normal gathering time all the way around. It's evening for us here in the Eastern Time Zone, right at the start of the workday for Professor Benedict, so I'm grateful that we're all here. Let me just say a few words on behalf of the lab, and then we'll get underway. First, like most of our events, this session is being recorded, and so you'll get a link to that recording in the next couple of days. Don't worry if you miss a point or if you have to leave early, you can always go back and watch as many times as you like. Second, you'll also have a chance to fill out a very brief survey on your experience here that helps us plan future events that respond to your needs. So just take the 30 seconds or so it takes to fill that out. And then finally, through a partnership between University of California Press and Luminosoa, we have Professor Benedict's books is available totally free in ebook format. So I will post a link to that in the chat here in a moment, and you can read wherever you are, basically. Now let me introduce today's guest, and I'll hand it to him. Timothy Benedict is Associate Professor in the School of Sociology at Kwansei Gakuin University in Japan. His education includes a PhD in Asian religions from Princeton and an MA in Asian religions from Harvard. He was also a foreign research fellow at Kyoto University. He is very widely published on the sociology of religion in Japan, and we're very pleased to have him with us today. Professor Benedict, thank you for joining us, and let me hand it over to you to talk about your book.
Thank you, Michael. It's really a delight to be here, and thank you for everybody who's joining. So good morning from Japan. Maybe a good evening, or maybe it may be other times if you're tuning in from other parts of the world. But yeah, so I'm really happy to talk about my book today. And so the book was originally based on my PhD research, but one of the things that I was kind of conscious of when I was putting it into a book format was making it, putting myself in dialogue with a much broader audience. So the original research was mostly aimed at a Japanese religious studies audience, but one of the things I hoped to do was to actually stay in conversation with not just religious studies folks, but also people who are, say, on the front lines of chaplaincy in many different contexts. And so this chance to talk to everybody here is a real, it's kind of a dream come true. So just to start off, maybe to explain in a nutshell what my book is about. So my book uses ethnographic and historical research to provide an up-close look at how spiritual care is practiced in Japan. But before I get into the contents of my research, I think it might be helpful to back up just a little bit to explain how I got interested in this topic in the first place. So the seeds for this research project were planted when I was actually working as a chaplain. So I worked in a hospital as a chaplain in Japan for about 2 years, between 2009 and 2011. But the way I ended up in this job was a little bit unusual. So I had just finished my master's degree in East Asian studies, and I was very interested in the subject of religion in Japan. And actually, at the time, my interest was more in the area of religion and politics. And I was trying to think of what I was going to do next. And right around this time, I had a chance encounter with a retired Presbyterian missionary who was in Japan, but was also a close family friend. And he had worked at this hospital for about 40 years or so. And when I ran into him one day, he asked me quite suddenly, he said, "How would you like to work at a hospital as a chaplain?" Now, for those of you who are professional chaplains, this might sound crazy, like you don't just pull in a chaplain off the street like that. But at the time in Japan, there was really no formal requirements to be a chaplain. And I had really no idea what a chaplain's work entailed, but I was very intrigued. And so I basically said yes on the spot. So a little bit of personal background, I don't have any formal theological training or even chaplaincy certification. So of course, I was very kind of concerned about this. I said, well, is that even okay? But at this time, back in 2009 in Japan, there was hardly any kind of chaplaincy certification anyway. And basically, as long as I was a committed Christian, which I was, and I had this letter of recommendation from this missionary who actually helped to found the hospital, this was, in their eyes, enough. And so I took this position and I began working at the hospital, and basically I had to learn everything from scratch. And I learned a lot from the other chaplains who were already there at the hospital, who had more experience than I did. But I can still remember when I first started there, I really wasn't sure what I was supposed to be doing. And the reason for that is also because chaplaincy it's not really that well known in Japan. It's not a recognized profession. So I would go to a patient and, I would knock on the door, or I'd announce myself, and I would say, "Oh, hi, my name is Benedict and I came from the chaplain's office." And usually there was this very quizzical look on their face. And I remember some patients, they would even say, like, "Chaplain? Like Charlie Chaplin?" And they really had no idea who I was or what kind of work I did. So in Japanese, the word for chaplain is just chapuren. They just use the English word. And so there's actually no exact Japanese translation for chaplain. So this context is quite important, actually, because while chaplaincy, I think, is more or less a recognized occupation in Europe or North America, Australia, other places, spiritual care is still not really widely practiced in Japan, certainly in most hospitals. And the formal kind of chaplaincy education has only recently begun to gain traction. So I should also note that it's another important context for understanding spiritual care in Japan is that most Japanese consider themselves non-religious. So although many Japanese will participate in Buddhist or Shinto cultural activities, for example, at New Year's, most Japanese will either go visit the shrine, the Shinto shrine. Almost everybody has a Buddhist funeral. There are different seasonal events throughout the year that where they honor their ancestors and things like that. These are all seen as just part of their culture, and almost the average Japanese would, if you ask them, like, "Are you religious?" they would say, "No, I'm not religious. I don't have any particular religion." So getting back to my job, it was extremely rewarding, and it was really one of the best things I'd done in my life. But it was also through this process that I realized that a lot of my preconceptions about what spiritual care is, especially in Japan, were wrong in some ways. And there was actually a lot more to it than I realized. And so in particular, I had this question about what exactly does spiritual care look like for a population that doesn't consider themselves religious? So there's this saying in Japan, most Japanese are born Shinto, they get married at Christian chapel, so they get married Christian, they might live a mostly non-religious life, but they'll die Buddhist, they'll have a Buddhist funeral. And so when you think about the kind of religious background of most Japanese, it kind of raises the question, right? Like, what kind of chaplain should be there? What kind of spiritual care or religious care would be provided in such a environment? So this is really how my research began. And so after working at this hospital for 2 years, I decided I really wanted to pursue this as a research topic. And so I returned to graduate school, and then this became the subject of my PhD research. So let me just share the, see here. See if I can do this. Okay, so this is the cover of my book, Spiritual Ends, Religion and the Heart of Dying in Japan. And let me just show you, this is the table of contents. So the first, I could just say the first half of the book, if you haven't read it, is mostly ethnographic. And then the second half is a little bit more analysis. So I think for those of you who are, the second half is more aimed at kind of a religious studies audience, but the first half is definitely much more full of kind of ethnographic anecdotes about what life is like in the hospice ward. and so forth. So feel free to focus on the areas that you might find interesting. Okay, and then I'd like to just say a little bit more about the background of spiritual care. And I should say that my book focuses on just hospice care. So obviously spiritual care, can cover a wide variety of contexts, but for the purposes of my research, I mostly focused on hospice care in Japan, because this is really where spiritual care began in Japan, and where it still is one of the kind of the main areas where people practice it. So hospice care in Japan, it started in the late 1970s, and the first formal hospice was established in 1981. And during the 80s, there was really just a handful of hospices. But then in 1991, I believe, there was a revision where palliative care, hospice care, became covered by the Japanese National Medical Insurance. And so at that point, it made it more feasible for many hospitals to offer hospice wards. And so they started to grow rapidly. And so the number of hospices grew to 456 in 2021. However, roughly 65% of cancer patients in Japan still die in a hospital. And so, but it's growing. So hospice care, like in 2000, about 2.5% of cancer patients selected hospice care, and this has grown to 12.5%. So over 20 years, it grew substantially. So it continues to grow. But there's a slight difference, I think, between hospice care in Japan and other places, and that is most of the hospice care in Japan is still located within or attached to a hospital ward. So in other words, although home hospice is growing, and there's a really strong need for it in Japan, it still hasn't grown as much as probably in other places. So I think, for example, in North America, when we think hospice, maybe home hospice might be one of the first kind of images that comes to mind. It may depend on the region, but at least in Japan, most of the hospice care is still focused within hospital special palliative care wards, or in a kind of ward that is attached to the hospital. And so my research was also mostly focused on the spiritual care that is practiced in those spaces, and not so much on the chaplains who go to visit patients who are in home hospice. And so I'd like to just show a few more pictures. I think it would be helpful so everyone has an idea of what you can kind of imagine what it looks like when I give a little bit more information about my findings. So this first picture, this is actually a picture of the very first hospice in Japan. And so it looks like that. And I just want to point out, I mean, I don't know how different it is from, hospices in other parts of the world, but certainly in Japan, most Japanese are very surprised to see spaces like this, because most Japanese are used to dying in a hospital where it's certainly much more medicalized environment, and so they really do put a big emphasis on trying to make it more home-like. And these are actually the spaces where a lot of the spiritual care takes place, and I'll say more about that later. So we have these kind of lounge lobby areas, often with pianos, so they can provide a lot of music, different activities. And these activities are really key to the practice of spiritual care. This is a bed or a hospice room. So the bed is right here, and behind it you'll see some tatami mats. This is so the family can sleep in the room with the patient. And actually, I think I might have another picture later, but there is also a very kind of a traditional saying in Japan where patients or people say, "I want to die on the tatami," right? So the tatami is, of course, has this feeling of home, and traditionally there was really no tatami mats in hospitals, and so this idea of being able to die on a futon on top of the tatami, it was kind of this kind kind of this ideal way of dying in a kind of home-like environment. This is actually a what we call it's kind of a chapel, but it was called a vihara hall. So this is at a Buddhist hospice that I did field work at. And so here you can see the Buddhist image at the front of the room, and one of the chaplains, they actually call themselves vihara priests. So vihara is a kind of a Buddhist version of chaplain is there. And then there's some staff. This is, I think, mostly staff. And occasionally a patient would also participate. And I'll talk about this later too, but this is a picture of a chaplain or a vihara priest at the same hospice who's working in the garden. And at this particular hospice, working in the garden was a large part, actually, of the chaplain's work. And this is a kind of a space where they would actually, they were trying to create this home-like environment for patients. And so, yeah, I'll say a little bit more about that later. And finally, here, this is actually from a hospice for homeless, for the homeless in Tokyo. And this is a kind of a very unique hospice. I don't actually talk about this hospice in my book, but I just wanted to show this picture because it's kind of unique. You can see the cross there. The Christian population in Japan is very small, less than 1%. But this hospice had a particular, I think one of the founders of the hospice had a kind of Christian background. And so they had this, but you also have other, below you have the incense and different kind of items that you would have more in a traditional kind of Buddhist altar. And here I think they have the Buddhist name, the kaimyo, which is the name you receive after you've passed away, your Buddhist name, and so forth. So there's a kind of a mix of different things here in this. Okay, so let me also just note that about 13% of current hospices have at least one chaplain on staff. And in contrast to the time when I was still involved in the work, there's actually now a chaplaincy certification program with several hundred members who work all over Japan. So it has become a kind of profession now, although it's still very minor, I would say, in comparison to, say, North America or other places. So let me now then talk a little bit about what spiritual care actually looks like in Japan. So I'm assuming that most of my listeners are familiar with chaplaincy in North America, where spiritual care is commonly framed as a kind of mixture of, say, sacramental rituals like communion, prayer, Shabbat candles, or for those who requested, of course, or even kind of a spiritual psychotherapy that mixes religious wisdom with kind of counseling methods, or more recently, I think it's just been more broadly described as a ministry of presence, right? So the emphasis of spiritual care is not just doing things for the patient, but being there for the patient, right? So we all know the phrase being, not doing, right? The importance of being and not doing. But although I think this describes a kind of idealized view of spiritual care, even in Japan, what I found in the Japanese hospice ward was that there's actually a lot more going on in terms of spiritual care, and a lot of it involves more doing than being. So that's kind of one of the key points in my research. So let me just put my cards on the table and show you one of the key points I wanted to share. So I say in the hospice, chaplains and other hospice staff, they primarily rely on a type of spiritual care that eschews the explicitly religious support in favor of helping patients be themselves by supporting the kokoro, so that this means heart or mind, of patients in relatively pedestrian but still meaningful activities, and through the maintenance of relationships that help patients feel valued and appreciated at the end of life. Now, this may actually sound familiar to many of you. I think if you are familiar with spiritual care in other contexts, this may sound, quite similar. But let me try to explain a little bit more about how this might be maybe unique, but also similar to the way spiritual care is practiced in other contexts. So you might be wondering what, let me explain what I mean by the kokoro. And this is actually a very key term in my research. And so, oh, sorry, I put my slide back up. Oh no, my slide got messed up. Okay, let me close that. So let me just say the kokoro can be translated as heart or mind or will, or even as self. So depending on kind of the context that it's used in. But one of my favorite definitions of this word kokoro is by Thomas Kasulis, who describes the kokoro as a cognitive form of affective sensitivity. So this definition really resonates with me. But before I explain why I like it, I should note that I don't want to kind of orientalize this concept of the kokoro, like, oh, there's this tendency to say, like, look at Japan, Japan and the art of, Zen, or, there's this kind of romanticization or orientalization of the way things are done in Japan. And I kind of actually play on that idea in the title of my book, which is Spiritual Ends, Religion, and the Heart of Dying in Japan. But while I do think there are some, important differences, I think there's also a lot of interesting connections. And so I just want to say up front that one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is kind of find a balance between portraying this idea of care for the kokoro as something that's distinctive to the practice of spiritual care in Japan, but also suggesting that it's actually quite similar to what chaplains do in North America, for instance. So I can remember talking to a chaplain in New Jersey one time who, after hearing the type of care that Japanese chaplains provide, responded to me by saying, that sounds exactly like what we do, right? So I'd be interested to hear from others as well about how much of what goes on in Japan looks similar or maybe different to what they do. So getting back to how the kokoro kind of encapsulates both this cognitive and affective dimensions of spiritual care, let me just first say that one of the reasons I think the kokoro is a key concept for understanding spiritual care is because of the way religious identity is understood in Japan. So I already kind of alluded to this in my introduction when I talked about kind of how Japanese participate in multiple kind of cultural, religious activities without really being devoted to, one faith tradition. But actually, this has been discussed a lot in the study of Japanese religions. And two scholars, George Tanabe and Ian Reeder, in their book, Practically Religious, they actually talk about Japanese religion in terms of cognitive and affective, so in other words, feeling expressions of religious practice. So in other words, while some Japanese subscribe to a kind of cognitive belief in a particular religion, many more sincerely enjoy this kind of affective participation in various religious traditions, and some do both. And so to me, this term kokoro really nicely encapsulates how both the cognitive and the affective dimensions of religious identity are kind of all wrapped up together in one, right? So, in English, we tend to kind of distinguish between the kind of the cognitive side and, the kind of more feelings. But the kokoro is actually, it's the same word that's used for mind. It's also the same word that's used for heart and for feelings and so forth. And so that distinction is very, very blurred. And so when you say caring for the kokoro, it's not quite clear if it's more kind of a psychological, cognitive type of care, or if it's just more kind of emotional feeling type of care. And so when I say that spiritual care in Japan is very focused on supporting the kokoro, one of the key ways that's done is, of course, there's a kind of cognitive dimension to it, but I think there's also this idea of supporting the the kokoro through these very mundane activities that make patients feel appreciated and valued, rather than this more kind of sacramental forms of care or other types of religious consolation. So this is why those kind of common spaces in the hospice are very important. All right, so let me use just an analogy that one of the chaplains, the Buddhist vihara priest that you saw in the picture earlier, he gave to me to explain what his work means. So he first asked me, he asked me this question, and I'd like to ask all of you this question: how wide of a road do you need to ride a bicycle? So if you need to ride a bicycle, how wide does the road need to be? And, I thought for a little bit, and I thought, well, I don't know, maybe like 50 centimeters, or, that seems like a decent sized road. And then he explained, well, actually, technically speaking, the road only needs to be 3 centimeters, which is about the width of the bicycle tire. And I thought, oh, well, that's true. I guess you could theoretically, ride a bicycle on a road that is only 3 centimeters wide. And what he was trying to explain to me is he was saying that these 3 centimeters, this represents the most important parts of hospice care. So if you think of hospice care as a kind of a bicycle ride, that the 3 centimeters where the tire touches the road, this is like really the medical care, right? It includes the morphine titrations, the fentanyl patches, all the things that might help reduce the patient's pain. But as you can imagine, riding a bicycle on a 3 centimeter road would be incredibly terrifying, right? You really need space on both sides. And that space, you might use it, you might not use it, but you need that space to really be able to ride comfortably and without anxiety. And so he explains that spiritual care corresponds to this extra space on both sides of the road, right? It might not be necessary, but it lets the patient have a smooth and anxiety-free ride. So what does this mean in practice? So let me just give you a few examples from the book. So one of the patients I met, he really enjoyed watching films. And this was just one of the joys of his life. And so what the chaplains, of course, did is they turned the chapel into, or I shouldn't say it was a chapel, it was a Buddhist hospice, so it was a vihara hall. They turned it into a small theater. And they put up a screen. They even joked, we need to set up the screen so that the Buddha image can also enjoy it. And they recreated this movie theater. The nutritionists made popcorn. One of the nurses created some like film tickets. And then they put on a spaghetti Western film that the patient really enjoyed. Another thing they would do is they would spend a lot of times outdoors in the garden where they're raising vegetables. And they would then invite the patients who are able to still move to come and join them as they're help with the planting, the harvesting, the weeding, the watering, and so forth. So as I was watching, the chaplains do all these kind of activities, at first the Buddhist chaplains would keep making comments like, oh, this might not look like spiritual care to you. Or one time they even opened up like a photo album to show me pictures of past patients. And they even referred to a certain period when there were actually several patients who had a very strong interest in Buddhism. And they kind of jokingly described this to me as like the golden age of their career in spiritual care. So on one hand, they knew that maybe their daily work maybe didn't look like spiritual care to their American visitor. But on the other hand, they plainly explained to me that actually all of this was done with spiritual care in mind. And so let me slide here. Okay, so this is what I was talking about before, the cognitive and affective dimensions of religious identity in Japan. This is a picture, it's called kokoro time. So this kind of shows exactly what I meant about the importance of the kokoro. This was at a Catholic hospice, and they would actually have this time where the patients would gather together, and then they would talk about things, things that being thankful and, just trying to encourage each other. Then I also want to show you this quote from a doctor. So he says, I think you can define spiritual pain, but spiritual care cannot be defined. So for instance, you could say that any kind of care that makes the patient feel valued, taisetsu, is spiritual care. For example, let's say a patient wants to eat watermelon in the middle of the winter. You search through various stores and bring it to the patient to eat. In a sense, I think this too is spiritual care. And so kind of supporting the patient in these very mundane ways is a great way to help patients feel valued and appreciated. And, difficult for them to experience loneliness, meaninglessness, or other types of existential anxiety. So in a way, they were working very hard to make the hospice a space where it would almost like a preventive spiritual care, as a way to make them feel so at home, feel so valued, that they wouldn't even start to feel any kind of like loneliness or existential anxiety. So as I was watching this, I was trying to figure out how I could kind of describe what the spiritual care looks like in practice. And so I ended up in my book using a kind of phenomenological approach. So that is to say, what does spiritual care sound like, right? What does it look like? What does it feel like? Or what does it even smell like? So in other words, instead of focusing on the content of care, I thought it would be more helpful to observe the way in which the actual manner in which the care was being given. So I ended up using these categories of vocal care, resonating care, and supportive care. And all these types of care are kind of aimed at supporting or caring for the kokoro. But one of the things I kind of emphasized in the book is really the importance of this supportive care. So I can show another quote from a nurse here. It's more about the way you carry yourself as a caregiver. Just asking the patient to talk about their spiritual pain isn't enough for the patient to open up. I think it might be more about saying good morning and providing daily care. These individual things add up to spiritual care. Within this kind of care, you affirm that person's existence so he or she can think it's okay for me to live today. So what you can kind of sense behind this comment is that it's very difficult for nurses, for chaplains, for anybody really, to bring up kind of very personal, kind of like spiritual anxieties that perhaps some patients might be wrestling with. But it doesn't actually, you don't see a lot of this kind of one-on-one type of real deep counseling type of interactions on a very daily basis. And there's many reasons for this. It does happen, of course, it does happen. But in general, many patients shy away from that kind of interactions with chaplains or from even with other staff. And so, so in my chapter, the fourth chapter of my book, I actually talk about this a little from the patient's perspective. So I did interviews with various patients and just really asking them about, so what are the kinds of, anxieties that you have at the end of life? What are the kinds of things that you would imagine, would be helpful? Like, what do you think the kokoro no care, the care for the heart, is aimed at, right? What are the kind of non-physical anxieties that you might have? And one of the things that I found is really how the anxieties that many Japanese hospice patients voice really kind of call into question this clinical category of spiritual pain, even while in some cases supporting it. So there's this real fundamental tension in the concept of spiritual pain, because chaplains suggest that spiritual pain can also be real latent, repressed, or sometimes just poorly articulated by Japanese patients. And so in that fourth chapter, I explore whether and how most Japanese hospice patients search for meaning at the end of their lives. And then both the patients and the chaplains I interviewed confirmed that many patients don't really raise these issues very much. In fact, many of them will say, that's life, or this is just things that cannot be helped. So it was a very difficult chapter to write because there's fundamental tension that I couldn't really resolve, and I don't think it can ever be resolved, really. But basically, on one hand, when you go into the hospice and you talk to patients, it seems that at first, very few patients even understand what spiritual care is. As I mentioned already, when a chaplain shows up at their bed, many patients are really at a loss to why they are there. So the practice of spiritual care really begins with the chaplain trying to explain, what kind of work they do. when I was working in the hospice, before my research, I remember I would be talking with patients, and sometimes they would say, like, are you sure it's okay for you to stay here? Like, don't you have any other work to do? And, I had to explain that, no, this is my job. I'm here to, see how you're doing and so forth. So this is one of the reasons why it's very hard to detect spiritual pain. In contrast, I remember I was visiting a chaplain at a hospital in the US, and I was just chatting with them in the cafeteria when, a woman walked by and, interrupted our conversation and say, oh, are you the chaplain? And he says, yes. And it's like, oh, my son, he just came out of surgery. He's on the 4th floor. Do you think you could go visit and pray with him? And the chaplain, oh, yeah, sure, but it's very hard for to imagine this kind of conversation taking place in Japan, because there's just most people are unfamiliar with even the idea of a chaplain or this idea of spiritual care. So this is one of the first kind of mitigating factors that prevents spiritual care from taking this kind of more direct approach. And instead, the chaplains rely on this more indirect or kind of supportive approach. And then another quick reason is why this kind of detection of spiritual pain is difficult is simply because so many patients now come to the hospice in such serious condition that it's really, increasingly hard to for them to even converse. So I think it wasn't several decades ago when the hospice care began in Japan, it wasn't uncommon for patients to be in the hospice for a month or two. So over time, they could build trust with, the staff and, maybe eventually even open up about how they're feeling and things like that. But more recently, the average stay is less than a month. And so most patients only come in at the very end when, when they really can barely, they can't even eat, and it's very difficult for them to talk and so forth. So, not only are patients unfamiliar with the idea of spiritual care, there's also the kind of physical limitations, but then finally, and this is, I think this will, I want to make sure we have times for questions. So I should mention that there is this general suspicion towards religious professionals in Japan. So one of the funny stories I heard from one of the Buddhist chaplains was, he showed up one time in his Buddhist robes, his garments, it's called the kesa. And when he came to the patient kind of, it's like, you're too early, right? So the joke being that there's this image in Japan of Buddhist priests as like a funerary specialist. And so the person, I'm not dead yet, like you shouldn't come, so quickly. But there's this stereotype that, Buddhist priests, they only, kind of show up at your funeral. They take the usually very expensive payment and then leave, right? And so there's this kind of suspicion about any kind of religious professional that might enter the medical space. Like, why are you here? What do you want? And so this is still, I think, one of the factors that prevents spiritual care from really taking root in Japan. But having said all that, almost all the chaplains I spoke to in Japan were very adamant that even if patients weren't openly discussing, or they hesitated to discuss their spiritual or existential anxieties, they could, of course, still be experiencing a deep spiritual pain. And so, I was trying to really capture both sides of this tension. So from, kind of suspicious or cynical perspective, you might say that, maybe those who are involved in spiritual care in Japan are maybe a little overeager in making the case for spiritual anxiety in patients. But on the other hand, I think from a more charitable perspective and based on the many interviews with chaplains, I'm very sympathetic towards this perspective. Chaplains would say that indeed there are just so many mitigating factors that prevent chaplains from being able to offer that kind of more direct spiritual care that I, encountered in the American hospital cafeteria, right? So maybe if these factors were removed, it might actually be easier for chaplains to connect more with patients and, take a more direct and less of an indirect approach. So let me just wrap up with a few final thoughts. So while I spend a lot of time in the book explaining how, Japanese don't really seek out this kind of idealized or traditional, what I call traditional type of spiritual care, I don't want to give the impression that these models are not of any benefit for patients. So as I mentioned in the book, there are always some patients who, ask chaplains to give them something to hold on to, that kind of transcends their death, whether that be God or rebirth in the Pure Land, or something like that. So although I do explain in the book that many Japanese tend to not openly show strong existential concerns, I think there are many exceptions. And of course, the kind of eschatological answers that Christianity or Buddhism gives to patients who are looking for meaning have given really countless patients hope and peace in the face of death. Finally, just one other interesting thing about spiritual care in Japan is that the ideas about how spiritual care should be practiced don't really differ much along religious lines. So spiritual care in Japan originally began mostly within Christian hospitals. And even though the Christian population in Japan is very small, there was a lot of Christian hospitals that were founded by Christian missionaries back in the day. And they, of course, had their connections with their denominations or churches in the US or UK and other places. And so they became kind of the gateways for the introduction of spiritual care in Japan. And but so although there was a kind of big Christian influence on the way that spiritual care is practiced in Japan, the Buddhist hospices in Japan actually often will incorporate the same kind of models. And in the same way, the Christian chaplains also work very closely with their Buddhist counterparts. And so what you find is actually there's not kind of a strict division amongst religious groups in Japan and how they envision how especially religious care should take place. And I mean, this is of course the model of spiritual care, right? It's ecumenical, it's non-confessional, and so forth. But it's just interesting to see how within Japan that has also they've been able to keep that model. So there's a lot more I could say, but I think I should go ahead and wrap up here, and maybe we can have some time for questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This has been so informative and such a wonderful blend of, the academic, your research, and also the situation actually on the ground in Japan, because I think that's what a lot of people are really interested in, is that comparative framework between what we're used to here in North America and what you're experiencing in Japan. So we have a number of questions here. I think we have plenty of time to answer them. And sometimes they kind of touch on things that you've already discussed, but it's good to have them really sort of explicitly addressed. And so Darren asks, how do you understand the Japanese conception of being religious? Or in other words, what are they denying when they say they are quote unquote not religious?
Thank you. Yeah, so this is there's a lot of ink has been spent in trying to answer this question. So what exactly does being religious mean in the Japanese context? And the problem is actually even the word religion is actually a very modern word in Japan. So the word religion was introduced in Japan in the late 19th century when they were basically translating, documents that were coming from the West, and they're like, oh, we have to find a word. So in Japanese, the word is shukyo, but it was actually a new word. They didn't actually have that kind of the word religion in Japan. So it all kind of starts there. But I think when they say they're not religious, what they mean is they don't have a strong affiliation with a single religious community, is what I think most of them would say. So they might kind of believe in reincarnation and many of the Buddhist ideas about enlightenment and so forth, but they don't see themselves as practicing that in a kind of very religious. So I think their image of religion is something much more formalized. It's something that requires like daily practice, something that a very kind of strong affiliation. And so for most Japanese, they it's a kind of a typical secularized society. They usually have a more kind of secular outlook on life, and so they don't see themselves as doing that, but they still like the kind of the affective or the kind of the feelings of that are created by participating in different religious practices. And so this happens. A nice example is actually the Christian weddings. So nobody, less than 1% of Japanese are Christian, but over half the population participate in Christian weddings at chapels. And there's several reasons for this. One of them is because a lot of women want to wear the Western wedding dress. They like that. It looks, they think it looks pretty, or they like that image better than wearing the traditional kimono. But when you go to a Japanese wedding at a chapel, they do the whole religious ceremony. Usually the person there is not a real minister; it's a fake minister. But they read the Bible, and they have like a prayer, and everyone's very earnestly bowing and praying with real sincerity, right? But they would never think of themselves as actually Christian or something like that. So for them, it's more of a kind of a cultural activity.
Sorry, I was looking at the chat, not the question. Stuart says, do you have a view as to whether pastoral care chaplaincy needs to be different in any way in a culture with conceptions of honor such as Japan? If so, how? And what has helped you informing your view on this?
Thank you. Yeah, so Japan is, as many of you may know, there's this idea that kind of honor or shame is a very important part of Japanese culture. In some cases, I wouldn't say it's important for everybody. I think like every stereotype, I think actually honor and shame are important for non-Japanese as well. And so it tends to get sometimes a little bit get maybe almost too much attention, but I do agree that there is that kind of overall that kind of emphasis in Japan. And one of the ways I think that it affects pastoral care is so in my book I kind of identify 3 kinds of themes in the types of spiritual pain that patients encounter, and one of them is this fear of being a burden. And in Japanese it's called meiwaku. Like they don't want to be meiwaku, they don't want to be a burden on others. And this is how should I say it? I think in most other contexts, this would not normally be considered a kind of spiritual pain. I think everybody, in any country or culture doesn't want to be a burden on their family. But I think in Japan, it goes a little bit deeper in the sense that to the kind of the shame of being cared for to the point that it creates this burden on especially younger people caring for their elders. And so it almost takes a kind of existential it becomes a kind of existential crisis, and it produces a very deep existential anxiety in ways that maybe more individualized cultures may not feel the same. But this is once again a kind of a broad statement, and everyone's different, but I would say that there is definitely a lot more kind of emphasis on trying to help patients die honorably, right? So in a way that keeps their personal dignity. And this is true everywhere, but there's maybe even a stronger emphasis on that kind of helping patients feel like they're not becoming a burden on those around them.
Nathan has a question about the effect of COVID on hospice care, and with those policies coming to an end, what impact has that had on hospice care that you've seen it in Japan?
Great question. Yeah, so during COVID, of course, I haven't done any field work during the whole COVID pandemic. Even now, finally, the hospitals are just kind of, even though, the pandemic is pretty much, passed in the public perception, the hospitals have still been very slow to kind of reopen. And so during the pandemic, I do know that a lot of, I think they did kind of similar things that were done in other places where, a lot of, online, right, trying to, put an iPad or whatever in the the nurse would bring an iPad, and then the chaplain could talk with them through devices. But I really think it did put it had a big impact on the kinds of indirect types of spiritual care that I was talking about, right? So all the gatherings that they do, because there's kind of a reluctance for patients to, like, they get nervous if like a chaplain just shows up in their room. What chaplains usually try to do is they, arrange for these, like, let's have tea time, or let's have, we're going to have a musical, sing along time. And they bring all the patients who can into that kind of common area where they feel more comfortable in the group setting. And that's a place where they talk and they chat and make, connections, relationships and so forth. But during the pandemic, all of those kind of activities got kind of put on hold. And so from what I heard from the chaplains who were, working through in those situations, it was just really, really difficult. Like they didn't know what to do, right? Because, just kind of personal conversation through online devices can only go so far if you don't have that kind of physical interaction, right? So, yeah, it was very, very challenging, I heard.
John has a number of questions. I'm going to just ask the first one, and I think this is really interesting. How is this kind of support paid for families and patients?
So I assume that the question is about, like, how are chaplains being paid for their work, right?
Right. Where does that fit into the sort of overall healthcare system?
Great question. So because there's not a very strong kind of understanding or recognition for this this profession of chaplaincy in Japan, the way it started was mostly at religious hospitals, so religious affiliated hospitals, and especially Christian hospitals, and then later Buddhist. And so at those hospitals, the hospital was often willing to include a budget for hiring a chaplain, simply because they already were kind of had these religious connections, and they saw their kind of medical ministry as a kind of they saw the importance of spiritual care as part of that kind of holistic care that they were trying to provide. And so in those kind of larger religiously affiliated hospitals, and of all the hospices in Japan, I think there are about 33 still now that are religiously affiliated. Those have sometimes one or more chaplains, full-time chaplains. But in other places, just regular public hospitals, they've been a lot more reluctant to hire to hire a chaplain. And so from what I can tell, a lot of chaplains will do it volunteer. And so there are some pastors who will volunteer as a chaplain, and so they'll come in once a week, or twice a week, or something like that, to visit and just see if there's any patients who would like to talk or need something. And other cases, they are like on call. So if they feel like a patient needs to talk to somebody besides a doctor or a nurse and social worker or whatever, they will call this pastor who's kind of on call, this priest who's on call, and they will then invite them to come to talk to them. And so I would say, though, that the number of like fully funded like chaplain like programs in Japan are still very, very small, and a lot of the work that is still being done is unpaid or part-time, or just there's a lot of things will start, then they'll fall apart, and then so there's a lot of it's very much in flux. So yeah, it's not a very stable job at all.
Sorry, what? How difficult is it to become a chaplain in Japan? Another question from John, but it gets to the practicalities.
Yeah. So there are now there's a kind of now a centralized spiritual care specialist training program that is there was actually a bunch of different programs that started at different times, but now they've actually kind of centralized it and try to make this kind of national certification program. Although it's still not it's not a certification that's recognized by the government, which would make it very like a social worker is like a official, certification. But chaplain or spiritual care worker is not. And so it's, but several universities have created programs to allow this kind of education to take place. And they do a lot of, there's a certain amount of the curriculum they have to do, and of course, so many hours. The difference, I think the amount of hours that they require are probably a little bit less than maybe like a CPE program in other places, simply because there are just fewer places where they can actually where they can gain the experience to do it, right? Because there are already so few hospitals with chaplains, and so to even find a place where they can practice, right, is very difficult. So I think in many cases, they have a very kind of loose requirements for the kind of places where you can kind of practice this type of this kind of practical, more field experience. But yeah, I think, in the comments is talking about Sophia. Yeah, Sophia has probably the most robust education system or kind of curriculum for that. And some of the programs do require you to have some kind of religious background, but actually some of them don't. And so it is possible to become a kind of a spiritual care worker without a particular religious, like formal religious training or background. And so it is kind of open to anybody. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Thank you all. I was telling Professor Benedict before we started that because of the time of day, I'm in a different space than normal. I now need to vacate that space because it's coming up on 8 o'clock. So I just want to thank you all for being here with us this evening. Professor, thank you. I know it's early in the morning. Well, not early, but it's the beginning of your workday, and it can be hard to sort of get your brain going right at the start of the day. So thank you very much for your time and your expertise. I'll thank everyone for joining us once more, and look out in the next couple of days. You'll get a recording to this. You can watch it again whenever you like. Thank you all very much. Have a great evening or rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.